I'll just tell everyone through Twitter that basically we're down on YouTube and to come to Zoom.
Yep.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Sorry, Bill, but go ahead and start the show,
no
Ben,
problem.
while I do that.
So 10 minutes late and not entirely true. We are live, but we are live on Zoom only, not on YouTube. We will post to YouTube later because YouTube has, for the first time in 77 episodes in a row, failed us. I hold Google personally responsible for this, and I will be following up with them. Not sure how. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. We're not even allowed to live stream our Zoom conferences anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Bill Kristol. I don't quite even know how to describe Bill Kristol these days. I was thinking about like what the right way to do it. I was going to say like sort of spiritual leader of the Never Trump movement, except that the phrase spiritual leader has a weird, Khamenei vibe to it that I'm not sure that Bill would appreciate. I'm also, the Never Trump movement is diffuse enough that I'm not sure that it has a single spiritual leader, but certainly Bill is one of them. But for those of you who don't listen to the podcast, it used to be a video cast, but now it's only a podcast, Conversations with Bill Kristol. It is just one of the best, generally informative interview shows with cool experts on a wide range of things, from hidden meaning in texts to China policy and its failures over a long period of time. So Bill, welcome to the show. Sorry we are not live on YouTube, but we will be eventually present on YouTube. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Ben, and thanks so much, and for that kind. I think it was a kind introduction, mostly, right?
It was meant to be.
Yes, no, exactly. It's the intention. It's the intention that counts. That's always been my line.
How do you think of yourself these days? I mean,
what's that?
It's like you used to be, conservative intellectual, publisher, former staffer to a vice president, Bush 1 White House staffer. And then, you were the publisher of the Weekly Standard, the sort of editor of the Weekly Standard. And then things got complicated. So if you had to introduce yourself now, how would you introduce you?
No, it's a good question. I try not to think too much about myself. That's why I'm not really a spiritual leader, I'm not very introspective on these things. I think it's easier maybe to go through life just trying to do what you think is right and having a little fun, hopefully, and making some minor contribution. I guess I would say this, so I think I was involved in Republican things and conservative thought for 30, 40 years. I came to Washington in 85 to work in the education department at the second term of the Reagan administration, and then was Vice President Quayle's chief of staff, and then did some Republican politics, and then edited the Weekly Standard, a conservative magazine. So no question, I was very much involved in things conservative. I don't regret that. I rethought certain things, as anyone would, and I think there were aspects of the less attractive side of conservatism that I probably fully overlooked, but I didn't pay as much attention to as I might have. I will say this, though, and maybe this is why I am where I am now, which is anti-Trump and from 2020 at least anti-Republican. I started off as a Scoop Jackson, Pat Moynihan Democrat, actually. I volunteered for Henry Jackson, the kind of Cold War anti-communist Democrat, and actually fairly liberal on domestic issues. In 72, I worked for Moynihan in the summer of 76 in his primary campaign in New York. I then voted for Reagan in 80, so so the last Democrat I had voted for, I think, for quite a while was Moynihan. But I had some roots, therefore, in a kind of centrist I worked for centrist Democrats. I respected Hubert Humphrey. Actually, as a kid in high school, I volunteered for Hubert Humphrey in 1968, which is kind of funny. I was anti-New Left. So I wasn't for McCarthy or even Bobby Kennedy. Not that they were quite new left. That's not fair. But
You
they
just
were.
said nice things about Bobby Kennedy.
I did. Well, we were just talking before the show about his speech on the night of April 4th, 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, which is really a remarkable talk. So anyway, I was sort of, I guess in that respect, I didn't, unlike some of my conservative friends, I was never, a 100% believer in the entire American conservative movement from Bill Buckley on through Barry Goldwater, and everything was great. I was liberal on civil rights. I was a New York kid, So I guess in that respect, maybe it was a little easier for me to say in 2015, 2016, Trump is totally unacceptable. And once he became president, and once the Republicans, elected officials at least, and the Republican Party really just totally succumbed to him, it was a little easier for me to say, well, I'm not part of that anymore. So maybe I had the advantage of having sort of, been a little heterodox even when I was younger.
Do you think that, one of the striking things you mentioned being a Scoop Jackson Democrat, and one of the things I've always been interested in about the neoconservative movement, of which you were certainly a part, was the relationship between neoconservatism and the Scoop Jackson Democrats. That is, I would talk to these people who I always understood to be conservatives, and they would say, well, I'm not a Republican, I'm a Scoop Jackson Democrat,
What does that mean? I don't even know what that means.
She's so young that she doesn't it's as if we're talking about, I'm a John Tyler Whig. I'm not really one of those Benjamin Harrison Whigs or something. I mean, I can see that joke. Eyes just oh my God, we're losing every here.
Joke
every listener to this
I
podcast
actually was an American history major.
What's that?
I will let Bill explain.
Let's reminisce about the 19th century, Ben, really.
I will let
I'm
Bill
just here to make you all feel
Scoop
old.
Jackson Democrats, because he is one and I am not. So Bill, why don't you give a little primer on the Scoop Jackson Democrats?
I mean, without going into it at huge length, I mean, look, the Democratic Party from Truman on, after the end of World War, Roosevelt was complicated, but a pretty impressive president, won World War II. Truman, I think also some flaws, but extremely impressive, and taking over and finishing the war, but obviously, and doing some very good things. I just today actually was tweeting with respect to Trump and the Confederate, the bases named after Confederate generals. Trump's appalled that we could change anything. These are the bases that the troops who fought World War I or World War II departed from. I'm leaving aside the total idiocy of that argument, like the name of the base means something. They also fought in segregated armies in World War I or World War II, and Truman changed that in 48. I did 5 minutes of research on this, and people at the time actually used that argument, which was in a way a little more serious at the time. You could say that it was only 3 years later. Gee, you're ruining an army. You're ruining, but you're socially experimenting, let's say, with an army that just fought this fantastic, war, and isn't it risky? So, but Truman ignored it, and it was good that he did. And so, anyway, just to get an example of how ridiculous Trump is, but. So anyway, the Truman, Hubert Humphrey, John Kennedy tradition, which I think Henry Jackson thought he was in, was pro-civil rights, medium liberal center-left on domestic policy, not hostile to Social Security or Medicare or the kind of some of those policies. Skeptical, though, in the Pat Moynihan way about some of these big government social programs and overt managing of trying to really bring, have liberal experts micromanage everything in the country and have a great faith in that. But that was a very big strain in the Democratic Party. It began to lose strength, maybe fairly or unfairly tarred by Vietnam and by the failures of the Johnson administration. And obviously the party moved left under McGovern, then it came back to the center some, but still. And then Reagan really came along and picked up the anti-communist side of it, and to some degree in domestic policy, the sort of party of opportunity, party of enterprise sort of thing. And so most of us became Reagan Republicans of one kind or another. So I think that would be my short history.
And
it's interesting when you look at
Jackson actually ran for president. I mean, he was a senator from Washington
State. Scoop ran in 72. Scoop ran in 72 as the kind of heir to the hawkish wing of the Democrat. I mean, especially on foreign policy, the domestic policy differences were often quite small. They were all pro-civil rights and kind of pro-labor at the time and so forth. Jackson was a hawk on the Soviet Union, and a hawk in a particular way. He was a pro-human rights, pro-democracy hawk. So in that respect, he was very much of an antecedent of the neoconservatives 30, 40 years later, but also Reagan, actually, who changed from being a kind of just pure hawk, let's just say, you know, we've got to stand up to the communists, as president, changed partly under the influence of some of the Scoop Jackson Democrats to being much more concerned about democracy promotion and the like. So Jackson really was you know, and just an impressive person. George Will, I remember, who was much more of a traditional conservative, actually, but a very nice tribute. Jackson died fairly young as a senator in, I think, 82 or 83, and a heart attack. And I remember George Will's tribute to him, which was really quite remarkable. And Moynihan, whom I knew and my parents knew, was very fond of Jackson and was a Jackson delegate to the 76 convention when he himself, you know, ended up winning the Senate primary in New York. So that whole tradition is, I think, a pretty admirable one. You know, it had its limitations and flaws, but unlike, and the Republican Party, conversely, you know, had in the recent past at least, had an isolationist wing, a kind of nasty America first wing, certainly an anti-civil rights component, which when it sort of absorbed a lot of the Southern Democrats, maybe became, I don't know, became stronger, but became prominent in it. So I was never as sort of convinced that the Democratic Party was the locus of all bad things and the Republican Party was the locus of all good things, as a lot of my fellow Republicans were, I think, in the late 80s and the 90s and then into the 21st century. And so I think maybe that made it a little easier on me psychologically to say, okay, well, you know what? I mean, American conservatism, all in all, I think, has done some good for the country and had a pretty good run, you know, and a lot of some impressive political and intellectual figures. But with Trump, with the total collapse to Trump, I wonder if maybe that era is just over. And of course, liberalism is kind of exhausted in certain ways too.
I was going to say that I think liberalism is going.
So I think it's a new,
like I like as a liberal.
So, yeah, so I think it's really a new era. I mean, this is one of the things I've come much more to the view of in the last 2-3 years, that you look at the two biggest political traditions we have, and you sort of, I mean, there are admirable parts of both of them, and certainly they give us some guidance going forward, and we'll continue to debate many things about government and markets and so forth. But it really is a time for fresh thinking and for sort of liberating ourselves in some ways from those traditions. But certainly on my side, on the Republican side or the conservative side, the total capitulation to Trump has been dispiriting, a little surprising, I've got to say, but really, I think, discrediting of the Republican Party and to some degree of conservatism.
So in this mixed up world, philosophical and ideological world that you're describing, one I want to go back to that Scoop Jackson Democrat point, because one of the things that I've always wondered about the neoconservative never Trumpers is whether their repulsion at Trump, or your repulsion at Trump, and hence marriage of convenience with the Democratic Party for present purposes, becomes a kind of Scoop Jackson migration, you know, just as the neoconservatives became this faction of the conservative movement that was internationalist, interventionist, sort of foreign policy oriented and disruptive to conservatism on certain very important questions. Does the Never Trump movement is its principal future as a kind of conservative wing of the Democratic Party, rather than being a conservative wing that is rooted in geography, which is where the traditional kind of blue dog Democrats are rooted in a kind of philosophy, right? That this is the traditional conservatism of which the Republican Party wants no part anymore, having embraced kind of authoritarian populism. Or so is there a kind of reverse Scoop Jackson moment going on right now? Or are you guys more homeless than that?
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I really don't know. I think it's one of the big questions for me, people like me, at least. Maybe not for everyone in the country over the next few years, but I think it's of some significance more broadly. I mean, you mentioned, Ben, the marriage of convenience. But I mean, all political marriages at some level are marriages of convenience, or should be, really, in a funny way, right? You don't want to invest too much in a party and a leader and maybe not even in an ideology. I think that's one thing I was reminded. I mean, I knew this at some theoretical level. I studied political philosophy. I taught it. One of the key things people who influenced me in political philosophy and the thinkers I respect taught was to have a certain disdain for ideology and to be, complex in your views of liberal democracy and free market capitalism. My father wrote a book, Two Cheers for Capitalism, and so forth. But let me just turn off this phone. So I thought I knew that one shouldn't be too invested in, as I say, a movement, a party, individual leaders, ideologies. But of course, in the real world, you get involved in politics and you get involved in a lot of fights, and you have your allies and you have your opponents, and you do get a little invested. I hope I didn't get too much. I think I was I don't think I was one of those who went way overboard, but I probably, in retrospect, didn't see enough of the arguments on the other side. Anyway, I don't know going forward. I think it's one of the big questions for me about American politics, certainly about me and my friends. Do we end up as a conservative wing of the Democratic Party? Do we end up trying to recapture the Republican Party? Is that really possible? I've become much more doubtful about that. Do we end up as some centrist force that works with people in both parties? That's fine. We don't have to have a party. We're kind of a small group anyway. Or do things really get shaken up? I'm much more open than I used to be, just again, analytically, as a sort of political science matter almost, to the notion that maybe these two parties aren't here forever. Maybe the two-party system isn't as deeply embedded as we think. If you really start looking at it, you can sort of see reasons why it might not be. And when I talk to my younger colleagues, Sarah Longwell and others who are more like Kate's age and aren't busy being nostalgic about Scoop Jackson and other people who died before they were born, I guess, almost literally, or certainly ran for president before they were born. I think there's a real openness to sort of rethinking. I mean, the authoritarian populism is very bad. The Democratic Party is less bad, but it has elements, I think, that don't provide a kind of compelling governing agenda for the future, and also illiberal elements. And you were the one, I believe, weren't you, Ben, coalition of all Democratic forces? Wasn't that your formulation back in?
That is what I believe in.
Yeah.
I believe that we should basically be organized around our pre-political commitments, and it doesn't provide a particular policy agenda, but I do think that is my fundamental orienting point.
I guess the way I would say it is, I've assumed for the last 30, 40 years, and I think it wasn't ridiculous to assume that, we can just sort of take for granted that we're in a liberal democratic, sort of free market, but mixed government framework. And we can argue about these important policies. Certainly in foreign policy, the arguments often got quite heated. How aggressively should we promote democracy abroad? How many risks should we take to do so? Use of the military and so forth. But basically, we agree on the framework. So that's sort of taking care of itself. The big lesson, and you were very early in saying this, Ben, and your colleagues, and is that we can't take liberal democracy for granted. We can't take, none of its aspects in a funny way, both the political freedoms, but also intellectual freedom in a sense. And so we really need to be, that's where I'm very much, and I wonder whether the rise of authoritarianism around the world, the rise of a kind of authoritarian populism, the rise of a certain kind of woke left, somewhat illiberal point of view. I don't want to, it differs a lot in different strands, but can be illiberal, illiberal tendencies on the progressive left. You put all that together, I'm now much more interested in just defending liberal democracy, and it has flaws, and it's a two cheers situation, and it's got limitations, and needs to be, always kind of adjusted. You can't just be a dogmatist for that either, right? You can't just read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty and think, okay, all the issues are done, and I don't have to ever think about, anything about American society or culture or so forth. But really, that's the one thing I've really come to. We need to fight for liberal democracy against authoritarianism. And that's a fight that some of us thought, not in a sort of simple-minded way, I don't think, but still kind of assumed it was sort of done, at least here at home. Maybe obviously not against China or against your friend Khamenei, whom you mentioned earlier. But it turns out that fight is not over at home. It's not over intellectually. It's not over in Europe. And it really needs to be fought, and probably that requires some fresh thinking to fight that.
So there's this interesting thing. So my area is generally I write a lot about private platforms and meaning like Facebook and Twitter and Google and how the policies of those platforms and a free internet kind of enhance the ideas of democracy in a lot of places. And what you have is this very interesting, I think, very interesting phenomenon that goes on right or is happening right now. You have at the beginning of the century in like the end of the 1990s, a lot of these companies fighting, and I would say companies, but I mean like Google even like until last year was fighting, and Facebook were fighting against the European Court of Justice, against right to be forgotten, and against various various like iterations of extraterritorial jurisdiction that they were trying to impose. And you have kind of this thing, which is this private platforms, these private companies that are not oil companies, right? These are not companies that I grew up with or you grew up with, or they're not like Ford wasn't like it was a global transnational company, but it was like it wasn't giving you unless you think driving is a basic human right, it wasn't a basic human, like it didn't govern a basic human right? It didn't have a governance system in place to say you can say this and you can't say this. And so seems fundamentally, like all of these platforms seem fundamentally different to me, and how they govern these things seem fundamentally different to me. And what's fascinating and seems to have been lost in kind of the very rapid history that's evolving in these is that they were on the front lines of kind of fighting against a lot of autocratic regimes that tried to take down a lot of terrible shit. Like there was, a lot of not terrible shit, a lot of really good stuff, like, the Arab Spring and like all of these movements in Egypt and all of these other types of like moments. And so what I'm really curious about is whether or not you think going forward that it is misplaced, if that continues, if private platforms and private companies can continue to be that for people, like a champions of democracy, or if we should not trust them because they are not democratic institutions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I guess I think it does make sense, and I think it's a huge issue going forward. And I'm glad that you and people like you are trying to think it through, because I don't think it lends itself to simplistic answers. I mean, as if you tell me, look, they're private companies, government should have nothing to do with them, and Facebook should just decide, or Google, that as it has in this case, that it doesn't want to show us on YouTube, I guess.
Yeah, we're being censored, Ben.
But or that eight people or 800 people at Facebook Central are going to decide this goes up and this doesn't. But de facto, since God, billions of people are on Facebook and et cetera, that gets me nervous. If you tell me that, well, we can't have the private sector do it, but government should do it, that gets me worried for kind of obvious reasons. And if you tell me, well, no one should do it, which would be my kind of first default position probably, but then it turns out that massive disinformation from authoritarian regimes or from bad actors who aren't part of the government.
Yeah, if no one does it, then the bad guys do it.
Yeah, and they do it, and they genuinely, especially now with deep fakes and so forth, can really disrupt politics, society, and so forth. That gets me worried too. So, I mean, my simple-minded answer in a way is none of those three is quite a satisfactory answer. So we need to think about it in a new way, as we did think, incidentally, about all kinds of industrial companies in a new way. And when they first came up at the beginning of early in the 19th century, and then at the end of the 19th century, obviously, with antitrust and all these things, so and regulation. And so I think it is genuinely important, and it's a big revolution. I guess I was sort of wrong about this 20 years ago. I sort of had the vague view that, it's a big deal. Obviously, it's great to have the internet, and we've got the phones, so we had everything at our fingertips. I still thought, it doesn't really compare. I remember being annoyed when people would say, this was 20 years ago, people of my generation who tend to think everything important happened in their lifetimes. Baby boomers are the center of the universe, not just for now, but forever. And they would say, we've lived through so much change compared to other people. And I remember always, and I didn't get this all the time, on campuses and somewhere, that I always say, that's really not true. I mean, in 2000, I would say I was born in 1952, my generation had lived through less change in terms of technology than my parents, or certainly my grandparents. I mean, who had seen, if you think of, that had gone from literal horse and buggy world through cars, cars, planes, and who had no television, obviously movies, telephones, and had gone, all the way to modern communication. I mean, that if you were born in 1880 and you died in 1950, you saw an unbelievable unbelievable amount of changes, to say nothing of world wars and so forth. And all the people who were born
or
like me in
if
the
you were
50s
born, or if
had,
you were born in 19, my grandfather was born in 1917,
yeah,
and he lived, you know, and he lived in the Lower East Side without electricity. And by the end of his life, he died at 97. We were sending emails to each other.
yeah, no, I mean, it's so anyway, there's a long way of saying that I sort of got impatient with the kind of back padding of modern people that, you know, we're seeing just such big challenges and changes. And having said that, I do think the communications revolution, the combination of the internet, the mobile device, the immediate accessibility both to everyone else in the world and to all information, in a sense, that in the world, it is a huge revolution. And I kind of underestimated that, I think, 10, 15 years ago. So I think it's extremely important to think it through in a fresh way. I mean, I was around in the 80s. I was involved in politics before I came to Washington some, and certainly in intellectual fights. No, and we thought, you know, I'd been sort of a conservative, so I was a little bit of a skeptic about technological changes. Orwell, Huxley, the great, you know, the writers whom I admired very much from 2 generations before me, were kind of dystopian, you know, writers about the downside, you might say, of all this technology, and not the upside so much. But I mean, I saw what happened in the 80s, and I was involved in a very tiny way in helping get stuff to Eastern Europe and dissidents. And Glasnost, it was very moving when you'd read about Havel's accounts of getting together to, you know, share information that was made possible sometimes by the Xerox machine first, and then the fax machine, and then of course ultimately the internet. And so I was kind of bought into, and I don't think it was ridiculous, to the notion that this is basically liberating and kind of a good thing. And that all goes all the way to the Arab Spring and Facebook and all, but it obviously is like so much else in life. It turns out things are very double-edged and complicated. And so anyway, I do think it's very important to think that through, but I don't have any easy answer, I'd say. And the degree to which people are being idiotic about it and demagoguing it is really extraordinary. So now Trump's decided that Section 230, which, I mean, he doesn't even know what it is, I think, is terrible and must be repealed. It's one thing for Trump to say that, but you have Harvard law graduates and, you know, the Josh Hawley and so forth, just being who clerked for the Supreme Court, who was perfectly capable of reading like Section 230 and reading 2 law review articles on it. It's not the most complicated thing in the world, you know, and just being really demagogic. And that's a very bad sign. I mean, if you look at history, demagoguery, I mean, complicated technological changes, which then will always provoke some demagogic reactions. But if those demagogic reactions are taken up by influential parts of a society and a polity, that's a dangerous thing. And that's that's part of the moment we're in, I think.
Just to follow up, I think that I agree with everything you said. You certainly don't need to complain about, you will find a sympathetic ear to complaints about Trump's take on Section 230 in this show. And Hawley's and Cruz's. I love everything you said about technology. It reminds me of one like short anecdote. When I was a modern American history major in college, and I wrote like a paper that was way kind of like crazy, but maybe forecast what I would end up working on. And it was about how basically nothing would have happened for, like, the American Revolution would never have happened if there had been any type of modern communication. That the huge expanses of time of the governors like having almost no direction from the crown, and overwielding their power, and the crown it being 3 to 6 months between ships going back and forth and carrying messages, allowed for all of this expansion and independence and kind of democracy to flourish. And that, like, if you had been able to pick up a phone and had a much more, if like King George could have like had a much more direct line. I know it seems like a specious point, but like I do think it's kind of an interesting human point about technology, and that what technology ultimately means for how we govern people and what people respond to.
No, totally. I mean, I'm sort of a history of ideas person, so I always want to say that ideas are very important and maybe decisive, and more than these kind of technological changes. And so I slightly rebel against people who go, you know, further in the direction you're suggesting, and sort of, you know, this technological change led to X, Y, or Z, you know, modern liberal democracy or something. Having said that, I very much agree that it's foolish to even to downplay the importance of these technological changes. And I mean, the example I'll use, if we're telling brief anecdotes, is I think when I was in college, maybe it was grad school, I had a roommate who liked to play one of these games, board games at the time, that was very popular. It was like strategy, maybe it was called. It was like one of these world, dominate. You were Napoleon. There was Napoleon,
Risk?
and they were the British, and they were, you had whatever. You moved your troops around, and you stayed up all night playing it. I never got into it, as you can tell. I was not very. I didn't get into this, and so I didn't do it. But anyway, he loved playing this one game. It was quite sophisticated, in which you would play out the Napoleonic battles. And apparently it was pretty carefully done, kind of historically accurate. And you could actually learn a fair amount about the strategy on both sides and tactics in these battles. And the one thing he said that he learned from this is if we had at this time, he said, modern communications, that's circa 1975, Napoleon would have won, like at Waterloo or something. I think I'm remembering this correctly. This was his point, that, he was crippled in his case by a lack of communication with different parts of his forces. And that, so just the technological change could really have changed the outcome of major world events.
I mean, and you think of technology and world events and wars as like being about like armories and like the ability, artillery technology, right? But now anyways, I just think that this is like one of the things that is really good. Ben, go ahead. I'm sorry for monopolizing Bill.
No. So,
no, but it does raise the issue that Ben and I are so interested in, which is, authoritarianism. I think we thought mostly, so it's only when I was growing up, we thought it was helped by modern totalitarianism, was made possible in a horrible way by modern technology. So we were slightly anti a facile belief in the virtues of modern technology and progress. I'd say that was the sophisticated view to have when I was in college. And I think it was kind of a reasonable view to have, actually. But we all sort of flipped over to the other side with the fall of communism, I think, and the growth of the internet. And so maybe we need to remember some of those. But it is basically the lesson is probably these human possibilities are always there, and they'll find different ways to use the technologies that are available. But again, I come back to the degree to which populist authoritarianism turns out to be a live possibility in 2020. That's, for me, I should have known that it was more possible than I thought it was. And I wasn't totally naive, but I was somewhat blind to it, I think.
Ben, can you explain a little bit why you thought why you guys would think technology, while you ask your question, could you just explain really quickly why you thought that like technology would be like a tool of like autocratic regimes? Was it surveillance?
Well, so I think this is the very deep influence of Orwell and the great Orwellian thesis in 1984, right, is that authoritarianism A, relies pervasively on surveillance technology, B, uses it, amplifies it, increases it, and that it becomes impossible to avoid. And that was a very deep idea that gave ground in the period of sort of 80s techno-anarcho optimism to the idea that, these technologies were liberating and they were transborder and they were information wanted to be free, right? This is the John Perry Barlow sort of, and that kind of both clashed with and adopted elements of the Orwell thesis, clashed with in the sense that it saw the technologies as fundamentally liberating, but adopted in the sense that it was super suspicious of surveillance. And the irony is that the technology that authoritarian populism relies on is not surveillance. And that's like the thing that's, we have this incredible surveillance architecture that is generally pretty well under control. I mean, it's got some problems, but, one thing Donald Trump is not doing is, using the PRISM program, right? Or all the things that Snowden disclosed. What's he using? He's using Twitter is his principal technology. And it's a technology that's as available to you as it is to him. But he's figured out a way to exploit it that is really, really effective in a way that I don't think Orwell ever contemplated, and certainly John Perry Barlow did not. And I've told this story on this show before, and I'm not going to tell it again. But the first president of a state that used Twitter in a kind of live interaction with the public was not Donald Trump. It was former guest on this show, friend of Bill's, friend of mine, Tomas Ilves. And we all thought it was charming and lovely that, you know, an actual head of state you could tweet at the president of Estonia and he would tweet back. And so I actually do in my heart want to rescue the idea of a tweeting president a little bit from Donald Trump. I don't think a president should be certainly not tweeting insults at people. But the problem with Donald Trump is not that he mans his own Twitter account. The problem is that he has nothing responsible to say about any subject in any forum. And so Twitter, you know, Rick Wilson always says everything Trump touches dies. Like, I don't think Twitter in the hands of Joe Biden is a particular problem. What do you think, Bill? Is the problem the tech, or is the problem the rotted human soul who's using the tech?
No, it's totally the human soul, or mostly the human soul, and those who were following him. And I mean, the tech is a means. I mean, it's a cliche to say, but it's true, and can be used for good or ill. And each of them can be used for good or ill. I mean, this is where sometimes when I give talks and people say, oh my God, this is so new. You know, Joe McCarthy was a very effective demagogue before Twitter, before the internet, didn't even use TV particularly much. He wasn't a very telegenic guy. And of course, God knows there were horrible, horrible demagogues and authoritarians before the 1950s even. And so people use whatever technology is available to them. And the radio, I think I read this, I'm no expert on this, but you know, in the 30s, intelligent people, Hitler really was helped by the radio. He was the first leader, I believe, the first national leader who really used the radio to kind of give, you know, demagogic, I guess, the way speeches. I mean, those kinds of crazed speeches, which he could reach directly to millions of people. He didn't have to go through the normal, you know, it's one thing if you read it on paper, if you were a German citizen in Munich or in Hamburg, you probably thought, I don't know, this is little, you know, but if you heard it, you got all excited and your neighbors were hearing it. And at the time, there was a lot of concern that radio would be an instrument. And it was an instrument. That wasn't just like stupid. It was an instrument of totalitarianism. I mean, yep. It was also an instrument of Roosevelt and Churchill in 1940 and to 1945. So I'm a big believer on the one hand, as we were saying earlier, Kate was saying, you know, the importance of technology. On the other hand, I do think it's a diversion to start blaming it or even lamenting too much. I mean, it is what it is. Most of the efforts to kind of rein it in qua technology are not going to work. It's not going to go well. Even if you rein in one company, the notion of instant communication isn't going away. And so then the question is having a better politics, not a different technology. But it makes it even more important, I guess, maybe the way to say it is, for people to stand up to this kind of thing, because you have less time and it can take over faster, maybe, is the one thing I think that's a little different.
There was another really important communications technology that Hitler used and I think innovated on, but we don't think of it as a communications technology. It was the airplane. In the campaigns that he ran in the late 20s and early 30s, he was actually the person who invented barnstorming by airplane, and he is one of the people who flew. I mean, he flew to tiny little towns. He would, you know, he was we don't like to remember this about him, but he was a mesmerizing speaker, and he was aware that his presence mattered, and he had a plane and he flew everywhere. And we don't think of that as a communications technology, but it really, really was.
No, that's a really great point. I was just going to say really briefly that, Bill, your point reminds me about whether this is a thing of the human soul. I love Ben's point about I don't worry about Twitter in the hands of Biden the way that I do about Trump, which is just reminds me when I give talks and stuff about this and people are like, well, we have to do something about this. We're so angry and these platforms are so terrible. These companies are allowing all this to happen, that I'm kind of are you really mad at these companies? Or are you mad at the jerks who are using these technologies? And it Balk's first law of the internet is everything you think you hate about the internet is really something you actually hate about humanity. And I think that it is a really well put, very pithy kind of summation of what it is that we're really angry about. publishes a video of a murder on Facebook, like them killing someone point blank range, happened multiple times and dozens and hundreds of times. And like, you're not actually like, Facebook did not go out and like order anyone's murder. Facebook has not done anything. What you're upset about is people are manipulating this technology. And it reminds me of Whitney Phillips' book, which is really great, which is called This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things, which I think is like also a really great kind of summation of internet history generally. Tony Cava.
And Tony, before you ask your question,
sure.
Everybody who's normally watching us on YouTube but is here on Zoom, today, if you want to pose a question, you are welcome to. Just we ask you to flag it in the Q&A and we will bring you in to ask it as we have with Tony.
Well, hello, Mr. Kristol. Thanks a lot for being on. It's good to hear you just talking as like a normal human being sitting in his library.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't see these things and realize that these people are people, whether you agree with them or not. So it's great to have you on. I have a question, but I just wanted to say one thing about Trump and Twitter. And Ben, I may have misunderstood you. You said something about it being interactive. And you look at Trump's Twitter account, he is followed by 82 million people, plus or minus. I'm sure half of them are Russian bots. And he follows 46 people. So it's, to my mind, it's really no more interactive than someone who has a TV show or something like that. But I guess it's a real interesting conversation and we could discuss it more.
It's a very interesting point.
Yeah. So anyway, my question to you, Mr. Kristol, is there really anyone left in the GOP who could speak with authority to the party and to Trump's supporters and change minds? Or is it, are Trump supporters actually lost souls? Is Trump so much the GOP and the GOP so much Trump that there no longer is someone like, say, a former President Bush who could actually pick up a microphone and say something that would be convincing?
I mean, I think it would be Bush or Romney or others can be convincing to some Republicans. I think not anything close to a majority, but obviously politics is won or lost at the margins. And it's perfectly correct to be worried about and think through the implications of 35 or 40% of Americans, 85 or 90% of Republicans supporting Trump. But obviously in the world of elections, that 10% who aren't supporting Trump matters a whole lot. And if that goes down to 6%, maybe Trump wins. And if it goes up to 15%, Trump gets clobbered. So I think this is what I've been involved in various efforts, Republican voters against Trump. It's why I do think it matters some when, a Jim Mattis who worked with Trump and who's respected by both parties, but maybe especially a little more by Republicans. He worked at least in this case, in the Republican administration, after all, Trump administration, in effect says we can't have 4 more years of this. And I think it would be very healthy, honestly, if more Republicans said this. I mean, they sort of excuse themselves from saying it by saying, well, no one listens to us anyway. We just look like the establishment ganging up on Trump. I don't buy that. And maybe at one point that was sort of true, but I don't buy that. If George W. Bush and Condi Rice and Dick Cheney, for that matter, and, even if they're mostly former electeds, former major, senators and congressmen, said, look, whatever you think of Trump, whether you voted for him or not in 2016, whether you like some of the policies, whether you think even maybe that all in all it was worth the risk and he's shaking things up, we can't have 4 more years of this. It's too risky. It's too dangerous. He's not getting better. He's getting worse. The guardrails have been eroded, and a re-elected Trump will be emboldened to do things that will really be bad for our liberal constitutional democracy. I think it would matter if those people said it, and I'm angry. I'm not angry, but I'm annoyed, and I've said I'm annoyed. I mean, I disapprove of their finding excuses not to say it. I really don't even see how you can justify, how you can get up in your former Secretary of State of the United States. I'll pick on Condi Rice here, whom I know and I like, so it's maybe not the best person to pick on, but and you get up in the morning and you think you have a lot of people who admire you, and you don't think you kind of owe it to the country, assuming she believes it. Now, maybe she doesn't believe it, but assuming she believes that Joe Biden would be an awful lot better president than Donald Trump, or to put it more precisely, that one term of Joe Biden would be an awful lot less dangerous for the country than a second term of Donald Trump, and that's the practical choice we have. If she believes that, and I gotta think she does, how do you justify not saying it? And I guess I really, elected officials, I don't justify them either, but I give them a little more leeway. They've got voters. They've got to get themselves reelected. They'll tell themselves that if they get reelected, they'll do some good things and check Trump. People in the administration, I give some more leeway to, because some of them are checking Trump, or have been at least. I guess I don't think Bush, Condi, George W. Bush, Condi Rice, and all those people would make a huge difference, but I still think their relative silence has been a mistake, actually, and somewhat it's enabled Trump to have less opposition than he should have.
What about the posture of somebody like Anonymous? So you have the Jim Mattises who stay silent for a long time and then speak out and, make a very moving statement. It has whatever effects it has. But you do have these people who are in the administration, who are, seem to spend most of their time texting Maggie Haberman, who are not outing themselves, and are doing almost all the communication that they're doing in the form of leaks, rather than in the form of putting their name on it, saying, here's the list of things that I experienced. How do you understand Anonymous and how his or her behavior?
So, I guess a couple of things. I would say, first of all, and this is relevant to the preceding discussion too, having said all this about individuals and their effect, I think the main thing that will affect voters is what's happening in the real world. And you can have an awful lot of populist self-delusion, but the reality does often assert itself. And I do think that's what's really damaging Trump now, though Mattis, I think, weighing in at a key time, along with some others, was important. I don't know what to think. You'd have to know the details of, to make some of these moral judgments. I think they are, dependent on knowing the circumstances. And there are people who have served, I think, honorably in the Trump administration and tried to prevent it from doing certain things, and left when they felt they couldn't put up with it anymore. Some who were still serving, who I probably deserve that categorization. Some who've rationalized doing things that they probably shouldn't have, and stayed longer than they should have, or served when they shouldn't have, and make themselves feel better by leaking occasionally against Trump, or having off the record conversations with reporters where they make clear, of course, they don't prove any of this stuff. I find that stuff annoying for obvious reasons. It's just self-indulgent in some of these cases. But again, some of them, I've never had the absolutist position that no one should go work in the administration. I have some friends who were pretty close to that, and I respect them. They're good friends, L.A. Cohen and others, but it's not quite where I've been. I've never had the opposite position that everyone should get a pass for just, because they do some good, you just get to stay there forever. The failure to resign, it is a problem with our political culture that just no one resigns when anything, even some third tier person hasn't resigned from the White House in light of recent events, people who maybe are involved in some of the National Security Council type decisions in terms of the military. I'm not so sure that General Milley should resign. He probably is maybe he's doing some important things in making sure that we have a military that follows the rules it should follow and isn't susceptible to real dangerous Trumpian control. He maybe made a very bad mistake going to the church with Trump, but on the other hand, he's now publicly apologized for it.
He's apologized for it.
And maybe that net is kind of a good thing. So I'm not willing to say that General Milley should leave, but I am sort of struck that no one leaves. And it's also, if you're some flack in the White House, you don't have the excuse that you're a four-star general who is doing important things to prevent the politicization of the military, perhaps. And I think a lot of the military top brass have done that. And you have to go along with certain things that make you swallow hard, but okay, maybe that's a tough moral judgment. If you're just some flack, you're just a flack, and the best thing you can do for your country is quit and say, I just can't put up with this anymore. And maybe you won't get
Isn't that the best
publicity.
thing, though?
You think more people would do that. I'm sort of amazed that no one does that, actually.
But is that the best thing to quit? This seems to be this remarkable, it's always been a trend, but collective action through quitting or protest through quitting. But right now we're seeing it with employees, not in service of any labor policy changes, but in protest of the like the policy changes their companies have. And you saw this with Google and Facebook and a bunch of other things. And is it always the best? Like, I feel like a lot of people are like, and the term for it might be rage quitting, but I feel like a lot of people are just like quitting, like angry, like I'm quitting in protest.
No,
Like,
I'm not for that. I agree with that. But I'm just saying,
yeah,
in this case, we're getting towards an election. I mean, here's where I guess I come down. And again, I would have made different judgments from 2 years ago in terms of people in the administration than now. No, I don't think people have to quit, and they certainly shouldn't rage quit and all that. But people really, we have a pretty fundamental choice in 5 months. And there are a lot of people who've seen Trump up close who know that he's not fit to be president. And I don't know if they would quite put it that way, but some of them would. And they kind of owe it, even if they're not the most famous people in the world, and if they're not James Mattis, it seems to me they kind of owe it to the country to give us their judgment. They don't have to reveal confidential conversations if they feel that's not the right thing to do, things they heard and either from Trump or from others close to Trump. I'm not asking them to come and dish anything. Just give us their judgment. I mean, when I talked to Mattis, and I can say this now since he's come out more, and he laughed, and I know him some, and I had actually tried to get him to run for president in 2016 as a third independent candidate. And he didn't really ask my advice, but we were talking pretty candidly. And I guess I said that was my kind of bottom line. He doesn't have to. And he shouldn't write some book where he describes everything he and Trump discussed or what he stopped Trump from doing. A lot of that might be inappropriate to discuss or even dangerous for the country in some ways, damaging. He probably shouldn't reveal what other people said in private meetings. It's not quite fair to them. You don't know what their motives were either sometimes. But he does deserve, I think the country deserves his judgment about about another term for Trump. I wouldn't say if he were just leaving after 5 more months, if Trump were at the end of his second term, if he weren't running for re-election, I'm not even sure I would say that. Then fine, then it's just a question for the history books in a way. But this is a real live choice the country faces. And now maybe other people aren't as alarmed as I am by what a re-elected Donald Trump would do. I mean, many people obviously aren't as alarmed because they're either okay with it or not fighting it that hard. But I don't know. That's where I guess I think this is a kind of unusual moment. It is one of these moments of choice. It is, your 1938, 1939 Conservative Party in Great Britain or something like that. And there are many good reasons not to quit and take yourself out of the game, if you think of it that way, and out of the chance to influence events. But there are moments when you just got to sort of say no. And I am somewhat distressed that so few people have said no. And the same would be true for Republican senators. There's reasons to go along in the past. You could do some things, moderate him, get some policies you want. But at this point, the kind of coyness about the tweets, right? And the idiotic, I don't comment on tweets. What are you talking about? This is Ben's point earlier. They're not, fine, they're tweets. They're statements by the President of the United States,
Right.
Many of which have important policy implications, or at least, if not direct policy implications for how we should think about our institutions and their appropriate roles. And you have no obligation as an elected official representing the state of the United States, representing hundreds of thousands and millions of voters. You have no obligation to say something about that.
Yeah, I think that there are some things super interesting there. I also just was making the point to a reporter that it was like that a lot of the rules around public figures and newsworthiness that Facebook and Twitter have, which I've spent a lot of time studying, basically end up solidifying power of those that already have a lot of power to amplify their message. So Trump could literally make his own Twitter account, which would just be like, not a Twitter account, but he could do the exact same thing of what he does on a private website that he runs completely by himself. And people would, and his message would go out there and covering it would be newsworthy and it would be all of these other things. But he likes the attention of like the community of this kind of this engagement. And that's what he really draws on. And that's also why some of these rules around content moderation make no sense as they're currently written. But we are going to go to Ken Landa, who has a great question. Ken, you there?
Yes, thank you. So without implying that anything was ever perfect, from where things stand now, what are the ingredients for fostering principle and decency as core values of the American body politic? I said in my original question, is it enough to swap out the president? I think the answer is no, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. And what are the ingredients?
It's a big question and a good one. No, it's not enough. I mean, Trump is a symptom, not just of deeper problems, but he also is a cause of making those problems worse. I mean, the analogy I've used, everyone's got their million you could use, is he's like an infection if you have an illness. You know, the illness has to be dealt with, and in short run and long run ways. But until you get rid of the infection, you often can't deal with the problem. And I do think Trump makes it so much worse. I guess that's where I slightly differ. Some people are more into he's a symptom, you know, don't get obsessed with Trump. I get this a lot, actually. You know, you're spending too much time worrying about Trump. I mean, got to worry about these deeper questions about the 21st century and modernity and, you know, technology and, you know, you name it, right? Hyperpolarization and the nature of conservative thought and the nature of liberal democracy. And I'm for studying all those things. But I guess for me, Trump is just a big part of the problem because he is president. We've had the Joe McCarthys and the George Wallaces. But they were senators, they were governors, they did some damage. But at the end of the day, it was somewhat limited and contained. We've had candidates for president who were pretty irresponsible, I would say, decent human beings like Goldwater, but would have been kind of not great policies, but they lost. We have a demagogue who ran for president as a demagogue, won, and now is governing and has governed for 3.5 years as a demagogue. And again, some people thought, and this was not crazy, during the transition in 2016, 2017, well, maybe Trump will change. And he's a jerk and he's whatever, but maybe he's not a well-educated person and all. But nonetheless, the office, the weight of the office, the Oval Office, it'll at least introduce a little sobriety, a little humility, and maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe it did for a tiny period, not much evidence of that, but it certainly hasn't now. It's the opposite of anything, I'd say. And if he's reelected, it's even worse. So that's where I think having a president who uses the presidency, and this gets to our Twitter discussion, to inflame divisions, to incite hatred, really, and divisiveness, to encourage all kinds, the most irresponsible and sort of reckless aspects of American society and culture. They're always out there. One reason we've survived pretty well as a country is we haven't had presidents who've mostly haven't brought out the worst in us, and mostly in crises have gone the other way, actually, and have tried to tell people, okay, look, we need to be sober here and calm and respectful of each other and so forth. And that makes a difference, I think. So I guess I am sort of on the side of Trump is a big problem. But if he went away tomorrow or if Biden beats him, let's just be more practical. It's not like we don't have a heck of a lot of problems in January of 2021, one of which is unfortunately going to be that one of our two major national parties could well remain Trumpist in spirit, and if not, and it's not going to snap back to a kind of McCain-Romney republicanism. And that's a problem because one of the benefits we've had here in America is two parties that were mostly pretty responsible and, not on the one hand, on the right, authoritarian populist, on the left, whatever, kind of communist or illiberal on the left. And, thinking through what we do in the next few years with one of our two parties not really we'll see. Maybe they will become recommitted to the basic norms, institutions of liberal democracy. But for me, that's one of the real challenges going forward. And I don't know quite where that leaves us in the Senate, whether it leaves us with three parties or just having to really work hard to have a strong Democratic Party or fight the good fight in the Republican Party, even if you can't win it immediately. Maybe the ton of good candidates will show up in 2022. I think this is impossible. Who won't be Trumpy, who've put off running for 1 or 2 cycles because they just didn't want to have to deal with Trump at the top of the ticket and have to either endorse him or not endorse him. And maybe suddenly we get a lot of young people who are more free market, more hawkish, whatever, pro-life maybe, but who don't want to be Democrats, but who are what I would say is the kind of Republicans we could, who would be a healthy addition to the party. I think it's very hard to tell that right now, though.
So actually, we need to wrap up relatively soon, but I want to focus a little bit on that point because there's so much in it. In a two-party system, it is an iron law of life that both parties eventually win. Sure. And right, that's the nature of a two-party system. And they can make themselves unelectable for long periods of time, but the long periods of time actually aren't that long, and eventually the other party fails at governance. And at least as a reaction to that failure, they get voted in. And so if you have a deeply illiberal party as one of the two political parties, eventually you were going to once again have a deeply illiberal government. And I therefore think the fight for the soul of the Republican Party is an important one, even for those of us who've never been Republicans. On the other hand, I look at the Republican Party and say, I couldn't tell anybody to join it right now. I couldn't tell anybody to, when Trump loses, go in there, or if Trump loses, go in there and fight, right? Because it's important to have a Republican Party that is a democratic force. And so how do you think about that? At what point does the party become so repugnant that you just have to abandon it, even at the risk of the certainty that eventually in a two-party system, that party will be elected?
I agree with everything you said, really. And you said it very well. That's exactly what the question that, I think for now, people like me can say, and I'm saying, no Trump in 2020, and really probably don't vote for any Republican who, at least with a few exceptions, who won't support Trump, and there are very few exceptions to the federal level. State and local, you can make different calculations, because they're kind of, if you're running for mayor of some city, you're not probably involved one way or the other much, and you're not necessarily a Trump apologist if you're just have the R next to your name. Though I would also judge how that person is doing. But I've sort of bracketed, honestly, that decision, if I can put it that way, until November 4th. Let's see what happens on election day. Let's see how badly Trump loses, if he does. Let's see what reaction people have to it. I personally would have real problems. Someone said to me, Bill, you need to, so the organizations I'm involved in are Republican, mostly Republican voters against Trump, Republicans for the rule of law, as you know, and I think that's been useful as precisely, and it's really been based, I've said this explicitly, it's just people who have been Republicans, so that's just a descriptive name. Many of them still are. It states where you register by party. Many of those certain Republican administrations. And so it's a descriptive name. And also it aspirationally conveys the notion that we would like to have a Republican Party that believes in the rule of law and that is not a populist authoritarian and so forth. Whether that aspiration is sort of reasonable, I think we'll learn if Trump loses over the next weeks and months after that. And then people have to make their own decisions. And I do think people could make in good faith quite different. If I were a 34-year-old running for Congress, I might just decide, look, I can run as a Republican in 2022. If Trump loses, I'll just say that Trump, that was then, I didn't really like him. Maybe I voted for him, maybe I didn't. But in any case, we need to have a forward-looking message on blah, blah, blah. And that would be reasonable. Personally, having been, being older and having served in Republican administrations, I would have trouble. Someone asked me, well, you need to keep your Republican credentials because, you need to be able to go to the Hill in January of 2021 and say, hey, come on, Republicans, let's get it back together and stuff. Honestly, if I were invited to speak with the Republican senators and Mitch McConnell called up and said, would you come? And I did this all the time in the old days, of course, like many of us have done in different groups, speaking to on various topics. I would have real trouble actually sitting down with Mitch McConnell and some of those people who've been such craven enablers of Trump, I would say, and sort of having a kind of good faith discussion with them. Now, I'm not, on the other hand, I don't know if they really. I don't really know.
I feel like you're the third person on In Lieu of Fun in 3 days. 3 days that have basically named Mitch McConnell as the worst. Well, but
I have to do it the other way.
Even
I
worse.
I wouldn't have that much easier time dealing with John
Larry
Cornyn.
Lessig, all people from totally different.
But I'm not sure I would have that
life.
much easier time dealing with John Cornyn or people who've been less outspoken. But I still find very, really problematic in their behavior. Now there are governors. There's Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan, and there are Mike DeWine and others who've just kind of stayed out of the fray. So that's where I think you could say, look, maybe. I very much agree you shouldn't just give up on it. I think it's irresponsible just because it really would be good, so much better to have a responsible Republican Party. I also think one can't be dogmatic about, I'm just going to fight that fight in the Republican Party for the next 10 years, no matter what, because at some point it just becomes silly. And plus you could have a good influence maybe on the Biden administration or on some Democrats, or maybe you could have a centrist group that isn't really in either party, but that really works with members of Congress. For example, I am genuinely impressed by a lot of the 2018 Democratic members of Congress. And I could see going forward I mean, I'm older and stuff, but those are kinds of people I would be happy to work with on various issues. And so I really don't know quite how that ends up. And I think it's an interesting question.
I want to ask, to close, your evaluation of one of the most peculiar figures in this entire period, which is John Bolton,
Yeah.
because he does seem to be eager, having refused a House subpoena and been denied the opportunity to testify in his preferred House of Congress. He does seem now eager to tell his story at 600 pages over the White House's objections in his book. How do you understand him? Is he somebody who is just trying to have it all different ways? Is there a core to which he's true in some sense? Would you have trouble sitting down with him at this point? How should we understand John Bolton?
Yeah, that's a tougher call. Personally, I've known him a long time, and we've disagreed on things and agreed on things. Been sort of vaguely, I'd say, allies on the hawkish side of the Republican Party, though his hawkishness is of a somewhat different kind than mine has been. When he went into the administration, I didn't necessarily condemn him. I mean, he was very ambitious. He wanted to be national security advisor, cap his career. But I understand that, and I think he thought he could do some good, and I'm not sure that, and maybe he did do some good in some ways. For me, though, I don't have much sympathy with him right now as he's fighting, I guess, the Trump White House to get his book released. And for this reason, again, maybe this is because I served in government, and so I think look at things a little through that lens. He had people who worked directly for him, who testified, so far as we know, utterly honestly and honorably, and incidentally were summoned to testify. They didn't even really volunteer before the Congress during the impeachment. So Fiona Hill was the senior director for Russia, and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman worked for her, and so they worked for Bolton. Others Bolton knew well. I mean, Bill Taylor and Ambassador Yovanovitch, and they were colleagues in a sense within the administration. And he didn't. Not only did he not testify himself, he didn't even defend them when Trump smeared them. I think I remember. I think I remember if he had, right? So, I mean, that's really, I think, dishonorable. He didn't have to go out on a limb and say Trump should be impeached. He didn't have to go out on a limb and say, yes, I said to Fiona that it was a drug deal or whatever. He didn't he didn't controvert that, right? So maybe he was implicitly acknowledging it. But again, where's the, leaving aside issues of classification and, not saying certain things that he shouldn't say. I just, again, the kind of keeping quiet, I just find it kind of incomprehensible almost, and that he didn't feel some obligation to clarify, either by testifying to Congress, but also just in terms of other public fora, just saying what the truth was about what had happened within the constraints, and you can't say everything, of course, and giving his basic judgment about it. So I guess as I talk here, I'm getting less sympathetic to dinner with John Bolton after the election, and I'm not sure he's that open to having it with me either. So, but it is amazing how many people have just got it. H.R. McMaster, I'll just close with this. I really did know. I mean, I knew him way back in Iraq. I mean, when he was a key person devising the surge and counterinsurgency strategy, and I was tiny bit involved in that on the fringes, but certainly he was for it and publicized it. I remember meeting him on some off-the-record occasions in 2004 or 5. A great admirer of his, and I remain a genuine admirer of his service to the country, and I think a very impressive person altogether. And he served, and he did what he thought was right, and I haven't, on the whole, criticized that. But again, for him, knowing what I think I do know about what his true judgment of Donald Trump is, and even though he wouldn't agree with Joe Biden on a lot of things, the idea that he's just sort of not going to, he worked with him so closely, the idea that he's not going to give his judgment of what a second term of Trump, whether that would be a good thing for the country or not, I find that a little perplexing.
Bill Kristol, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure, notwithstanding the tech difficulties, and we hope you'll come back.
I'd be very pleased to, and congratulations on this show and all the other work you guys have been doing. And I'm a big fan, as you know, Ben, so I'd be happy to come back sometime.
Bill, it was so great to meet you.
Hey,
yeah,
nice to meet you
this was lovely. Really, thank you for such a rich conversation.
Well, thank you.
So tomorrow we have Catherine Rampell from the New York Times, and I hope the YouTube connection will work tomorrow. And until then, Kate, what do we say?
If you can't have fun, in lieu of fun, come hang out with us and stay or leave the Republican Party as you will.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.